Hi everyone, welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan, and on this episode of Wandering DMs, we have a very special guest, Mr. Matt Finch, who is the creator of the award-winning Swords and Wizardry game. He's author of the Quick Primer on Old School Gaming, and he's creative director at Frog God Games. Matt, thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm pleased to be here.
Awesome. So you have been one of our top hunts, one of our top quests for a guest, and Paul and I have wanted to get you on for quite some time, and our viewers and patrons have wanted to see you as well. So we finally found some time that you could join us, and we're so thrilled about that. How have you been doing in the last year? You know, so we spoke really briefly just days before the quarantine happened in 2020, actually. So how have you been doing in the last year with that?
Oh, pretty well. I mean, I live in an apartment, and I've got Zach Glazer, who is the chief operating officer of the company, lives in the same complex, and we've got this little office that we work from. So really, I've done like many other good nerds, and just batten down the hatches, stayed in my place. I can walk to the grocery store, walk anywhere that I need to, and it's been basically that.
I'm glad to hear that, and pretty much same for me. Paul wants to get out more than I do. I will say that. So Paul's looking forward to getting with other people. I'm like, this has been going pretty well for me, I'd say.
I mean, when we talked, it was back at TotalCon, which was like I think the last convention we got to go to before those all shut down. I'm very eager to see those get started up again, though my suspicion is it will take some time. That's a setting that's gonna need a little more reassurance to get back to.
Pretty soon.
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to be going to North Texas, which I think is probably the first scheduled convention that's opening up, and that is because that's next month. So we'll be there. We'll see how they're able to handle all of the difficulties and stuff involved in it. But I think it's a really small con, so I think it'll be a good ratchet in to step up to larger things like Gen Con.
Awesome. We'll be watching that eagerly, I think, to see how it goes.
I got my Gen Con ticket this morning. They just opened it up this morning.
Oh really? Wow. I don't dare. A Gen Con's so big, I don't dare to go that anymore. I think I saw a video of people going in like 2 years ago, and I was like, it's not for me.
I suspect it's going to be a little bit less packed in this year, so just a suspicion.
Okay. I'd agree with that. Yeah.
And that's pushed to September, right? Normally August, but it's September this year, right?
Yeah, mid-September.
I will say to our viewers, we do have Peter Atkinson, who runs Gen Con, scheduled for, I think, around September 1st of this year, actually, to tell us what's happening with Gen Con just before that kicks off. So we'll look forward to that in a couple of months. It's funny about North Texas because I feel like it has a bigger mind share for me than its actual size. Like for my mindset, I guess particularly for old school gaming, is like, well, there's Gen Con, and then there's like Gary Con and North Texas kind of on the same plane to my mind.
Yeah.
So it's influential, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's got influence that's sort of larger than its size, just because it was founded really as a hobby con. By Doug, who is, and what he did was he tries to get a ratio of special guests to attendees that's way higher than most places do, because it's his vacation, and so it's always had a really large number of special guests, and also the special guests, since they're mostly people who worked for TSR, people whose influence is further back. It's a little bit less effort to be able to meet the requirements of what the special guests are. You don't have people who are, currently at the top of a media market, who are going to be charging accordingly. So it's able to do that.
Interesting. Very cool. All right. Now I noticed, and that's really good. So I felt really bad when I noticed that you had a new adventure that you were doing an Indiegogo campaign for that just wrapped up like a week ago or so. And I wish that we'd caught you while that was still running, but it was very successful. So it hit its goal on Indiegogo by over time 6, and that is your adventure, Death Ship of the Roach Princess, which is, I mean, they're all wonderful titles, but that's among my favorite titles to date. Can you tell us just like elevator pitch, like what that one's about?
Sure. It's well, it was originally planned. What had happened was that we had one that came out before it called The Fiend of Turlin's Well, which was written by Skeeter Green, and it was originally planned as being the first. That his one was planned as being the first in an arc of 12 adventures, and then we decided that we would go with the Indiegogo and just use the first one. So what you had there was an adventure in his that left a lot of loose ends that were supposed to get tied up over the course of the later adventures. And so what I did was I wrote a second adventure that tied up all of those loose ends, and so I went into it with that objective to do. But Death Ship is actually it's freestanding, but it can also be used either as a sequel or as a prequel to Skeeter's adventure, Fiend of Turlin's Well. And this is the actual, this is the printer proof, so if there are any mistakes on here, that's because it's a proof only. So there's that. It starts with the extreme likelihood that the characters are going to get trapped on a ship that they're investigating. It's not quite all the way over to the slave lords thing of you begin in a dungeon, sort of thing. But the likelihood that they're going to get trapped, especially since it's an adventure for first through third level characters, is very, very high. And then the objective is to get out. And it begins with a ship. The ship is. What level of spoilers do you want to get here on the elevator?
Whatever you're willing to share. Whatever it's up to you, Matt.
Well, I guess we'll say that at the core of it is the demon princess of Dimensions, who is that's the Roach princess, and she controls gaps between reality. And so what happens is that this ship. In the ship itself, there are many, many little dimensional gates leading to places that sort of comprise the ship, and the objective is to get out. Is to get out of Dodge and bring anything with you that you can, and you're moving between these interdimensional places. There are I'll leave it at that, but because people ought to have something to read and figure out what the whole thing is. But in the playtesting, for example, one of the playtesters said, "This is the most scared I've ever been of the dungeon itself that I've ever played." And one of the groups, when they figured out how to get out, they almost left without any of the treasure that they had stacked up to go, because they just wanted to get out. And so they were saying that group said, I don't think I've ever almost forgotten to bring treasure out of an adventure before. So
that's awesome.
That is great. Well done.
Dan has a theory about how all D&D ultimately devolves into horror.
It can.
Yeah.
It can.
Yeah, quite. Now, the Indiegogo for that is over. Can we, if somebody was dumb enough to miss that, can we get that someplace now, or do we have to wait for that to show up on Frog God?
I think you have to wait for it to show up on Frog God, although I don't think it will be terribly long. We do the printing through an actual print shop in the States for our Indiegogos. Which we really sort of gelled during COVID, trying to get local businesses to be helped out by what we were doing. So what that means is that before it goes on drive-through, we do have to have somebody go in and format it for print on demand, which will take a little while. But I do think that we're putting those up on drive-through and also on the Froghead website. But I don't think it's up yet.
Okay. Very interesting. Now, one thing I noticed about that, obviously, is we have the cover page on screen right now. On the bottom right of the promo image notes that adventure is statted both for Swords and Wizardry and 5th edition D&D. How long have you been making adventures like that? And where do you start writing the adventures nowadays? With which one do you have in mind normally?
It depends on the author. We've been doing that almost since we started in 2010. but we were doing it with Pathfinder rather than with D&D, and so we were doing Pathfinder and Swords and Wizardry. And the process is pretty long and involved because it's less difficult with 5th edition D&D than it was with Pathfinder. I mean, you can see that with Pathfinder, which is a very, very granular system, versus Swords and Wizardry, which is a very, very light abstract system. There are going to be design features incorporated that are cool for Pathfinder, but shitty for. Sorry. Hey, what's our swearing policy on this show? I should ask that. All right.
Right around that. You're allowed 4 per hour. I think the rule.
Okay.
According to Wandering DMs by
right. So backtracking to what I was saying before my mouth took over control of my brain. In Pathfinder, a lot of times what people who are buying a Pathfinder adventure, and to a lesser degree what people who are buying a 5th edition adventure want to see, is stats and creative use of the rules to carve out a new mechanism by which something will happen. In Swords and Wizardry, that's usually not it. What you're looking for is something that is a flavorful description that the DM is going to interpret. And so in general, it works better to write adventures for the old school system, because then you have got your interesting interpretation with a full description of what's going on, what might change things, so on and so forth. And then somebody who is using the more granular system to take that and be able to simply put numbers onto it. Whereas if you're just writing, here's a number that's going to be used for determining something, if you're converting it into Swords and Wizardry and all you've got is the number, then your converter is put into the role of having to flesh out a flavor description of what goes on. So usually it does work better when you're starting with the old school adventure. With Death Ship, I definitely started with Swords and Wizardry, and then Edwin Nagy, who does the majority of our 5th edition conversions, went in and adapted that to where it would work with not only 5th edition rules, but also with 5th edition, call it sensibilities or expectations. I mean, there are sort of cultural, social expectations from customers about what kinds of things are going to be done in an adventure, with probably the most obvious of those being that if you're going totally old school, you can have something that is rocks fall, everyone dies, because you should not have gone into this, and there were a couple of clues that you shouldn't have gone into this. But once you're into it, it's not a saving throw. It's if that much rock falls on you, then you're going to die. Whereas there is an expectation that you simply won't see that in a 5th edition type of adventure, and that was also the case with Pathfinder, that no matter what mistakes I may have made, I should still get a saving throw, because a lot of the game itself is built on the character sheet, and therefore there are rules-based things that are expected to be able to kick in, and that you're sort of violating the social contract if you have something that's rocks fall, everyone dies. So that kind of thing gets worked in as well. As it's not just number crunching to do conversions.
That's a really, I think, fascinating insight, and kudos for doing that level of translation. I know. We've talked, I think, about this topic with a few other guests. I mean, all the way back to our first guest ever, Ian McGarty, when we talked about publishing D&D stuff. And I myself have written stuff.
Ian was your first guest. That must have been a spectacular show.
Right?
It was indeed. Yeah.
I could do a whole show just talking about Ian McGarty.
I think most of our discussion there about like 5e versus old school boiled down to like page count, right? Just that like for 5th edition level stats, you just need a lot more pages. But to take it to that level, I think is fascinating of like what are the expectations of the players and how does that differentiate between Swords and Wizardry versus 5th edition or old school in general and the newer games. I know we're going to get eventually to talk about the old school primer, and I feel like that's like we're just teasing at that right now.
Well, I got to say that what Matt just said was probably the single most cogent summary of that difference that I have seen. So I'm like, right, Matt was totally the right guy to write the old school primer, because that was like the best possible expression of that issue right there. When kind of slightly follow it up. So we're our show, right, tries to do this same straddle job of, on any particular week, we talk original D&D and we talk 5th edition, and we kind of try to straddle it. And, you know, it's actually been moderately successful, all things considered. And I assume that if you're continuing that at Frog God and Necromancer, that you're finding the same. I remember that the beginning of last year, you go back to January 2020, there was this really nice, so right before the pandemic happened, there was this really nice article written on a site called Dicebreaker by, what was his name? I'm not coming up with the author's name, but a really nice article on this Dicebreaker site about it's like the fanatics who still play original D&D from the 70s or something like that. And it was primarily written with a whole bunch of quotes from you and me, actually. So if somebody looks up the Dicebreaker article, the whole thing is just quotes from Dan Collins and Matt Finch all the way down. Which I thought I was an astounding good company about, frankly. And when the author contacted me, I was like, really? Okay, great, how wonderful. Now, so they were saying, okay, some people still do that. Some people still play original D&D. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we know that, you know, market-wise, as people were locked up, there was like this huge explosion in people watching D&D live plays on YouTube, and Critical Role took off even more than it used to, and the virtual tabletops were seeing a huge influx of players. And so I'm wondering did you guys see like an additional influx in the last year to old school and Swords and Wizardry, or is 5th edition just sucking all that new interest up?
I think that the overall body of old school games probably saw an upsurge. Swords and Wizardry, we were in the middle. We had already done a long time ago a Kickstarter for the box set of Swords and Wizardry, and all through that period of time, we were waiting for that to get printed in China and delivered to us. So we were sort of in a holding pattern, really, on that. Now, Doug Zielsdorf, who runs our organized play system, did see a big upsurge in the number of people who were playing Swords and Wizardry online. But I think what you saw mostly was, various, call them retroclone or simulacrum games, or going back to an old school, but it's a new system. But those sort of games that people have been publishing really ever since Osric. There's been lots and lots and lots of variant old school style games. I think those probably saw an upsurge because the Old School Essentials, I think, came out during that period or just before. Yeah. And I think there was a lot of interest in Old School Essentials, which is basically a BX, Basic Expert Set, which is going back to what's called the Red Box that was published by Moldvay, I believe. I'm not 100% sure that it's that one. Most of the old school systems that people build things from are either OD&D, Advanced D&D, that Red Box from like 1980, I think it is, and then the 83 BACME system that Frank Mentzer was behind. And those tend to be the cores that people do something from. It's either they're trying to actually clone the rules, or they're taking that as the fundamental basic engine for the system that they're doing, only they're trying to improve it by putting their own house rules in, so there's various approaches to it. But my guess would be that the old school probably did see quite a bit of additional activity, although really hard to say because those, by definition, the people who are playing the majority of the people playing those games probably weren't on virtual tabletops until they had to be. So it may not be additional interest. What you may be seeing is just additional interest in VTTs, virtual tabletops, more than it is necessarily the old school. No real way of telling that, but there certainly was more activity.
Yeah, interesting. I was looking at numbers. Go ahead, Paul.
I just want to quickly call out our excellent chatters who have linked to the article on Dicebreaker and pointed out that the author is named Stephen T. Wright. Thanks, everyone.
Right. I like what Stephen did with that quite a bit. So yeah, I would recommend folks read that from the start of last year. What was my? Yeah, and the other thing is I was looking at like numbers on from I think Fantasy Grounds again right before the pandemic hit, and they were running 70% 5th edition, they were running 8% Pathfinder at the time, which actually I was slightly surprised Pathfinder was still as high, and then everything else kind of smaller numbers than that, which is interesting to see. Let me ask this. So again, trying to straddle, I'm realizing that I might have made a huge mistake here. Just in case we have
invited me out of the show. I can see that a lot of people reach that point really early on when they're talking to me.
I think that's exactly off. That was the best thing I've done in the last 2 weeks, frankly. So the thing I haven't done, just in case we have a viewer that doesn't know what Matt's Swords and Wizardry game is, we should say it is what some people call a retroclone that should be compatible with, what some of us call classic D&D, or what our friend William, I think, calls pre-2000 D&D, which would be, really, you can take a Swords and Wizardry adventure and you can play original D&D, or first edition, or second edition AD&D, or basic, or BX, or BECMI, or Osric, or any of those kinds of retro clones, or old school essentials, and they're really entirely compatible.
It depends on your level. It depends on your level of focus, because all of the games that were pre-D20 are going to be largely compatible with each other. They had the same basic structure of the way they were doing. So you can, and I will hold up, since I've got, and again, this may be a printer proof or it may not. I don't know whether this is the actual thing or not. This is the box set that we've started delivering this through Kickstarter. We did the Kickstarter a long time ago. We've actually started sending these out. Probably most people have already gotten them. But what Swords and Wizardry is it's the original box set. Let me see if I've got one to hand. I don't. It's in the other room. It's the original D&D set, which contained 3 booklets, and then it also pulls in the supplements. There we go. Okay, so this is what I need to hear. What's those supplements? And then in addition to that, Swords and Wizardry Complete also pulls in various articles from the Strategic Review, because, for example, the Ranger did not actually show up in original D&D at all. It showed up in the in advanced D&D, but there was an article in the Strategic Review. And so basically any source that we could pull in that was original D&D, so that you are created with a snapshot of this was original D&D at the very moment that Advanced D&D came out, right before Advanced D&D came out. And the scope of it is pretty much the same as Advanced D&D. It's not very much smaller in terms of the overall scope, but it is a much rules lighter system than Advanced D&D. So this is a way for people to play the original version of the game. And it is designed to be as close to the rules as legally possible. So there's nothing in there that is me sort of trying to redesign what it was that Gary wrote. It's just, this is what Gary wrote. We even tried to leave the ambiguities intact, although when there was an ambiguity, we would generally say either, we've talked to a whole bunch of people who played, and really this wasn't actually an ambiguity. It was done this way, not the other one. The largest one of those being Initiative. Original D&D did not contain an initiative system until Eldritch Wizardry came out. And I personally do not like the initiative system that they came out with Eldritch Wizardry. What Gary said was look at Chainmail, which was a war game, fantasy war game that they had done. But the problem is that Chainmail simply does not work for initiative in D&D. It can't be done. What he wanted, he was trying to cross-sell something. I did that a whole bunch, but it really doesn't work. And so what we've got in Swords and Wizardry, there we go. What we've got in Swords and Wizardry is we do one default, because it's modern times. People have to be told, here is your default rule set. There has to be something in order for someone to learn a thing. So here is your default, but here are all the other ways in which you can do initiative. Because the idea back at the time of OD&D with the wargamer mindset was absolutely, you house ruled everything in those wargaming clubs. People actually rented buildings, kept the minis there. There were people who went there, every week, a couple times a week. It was very much a different world. Nobody could afford to do something like that now, but that's the way that it was kind of done. And people were very, very comfortable with the idea that, here's a rule set that is made up entirely of options. And so we tried to, leave those options intact, but phrase them more in terms of options rather than everything being rather than there is no core rule set. So there is a core here that you can follow and learn, but here are all of the house rules. So it's a pretty close clone. There are various things in there that are different from original D&D. Those are only for legal reasons. So for example, the strategic review version of the Illusionist is not in there, and the reason is that the legality of Swords and Wizardry is based on the Open Gaming License, which tags into the system reference document. What ended up in the system reference document was a thread. What ended up in the system reference document was a very different Illusionist than the one that was published in the strategic review. What's published in the strategic review is therefore not that copyright and those thoughts were not. They never got bundled into the system reference document. So it would be a copyright violation to basically reproduce a lot of the flavor and so on from the Illusionist that showed up in the strategic review. So that's not in there. But the Ranger, on the other hand, the whole strategic review presentation of the Ranger went almost precisely into the SRD. So that was one where we did have the legal safe harbor. So getting way down a rabbit hole here, but that's in terms of what Swords and Wizardry is it is a way of playing the full scope of OD&D codified into one book so that it's all in one place. It's a lot easier to learn than the original presentation of it, which was done piecemeal as they published it. And there are going to be some variations from it, but those variations were designed by people who intimately knew OD&D and worked it in there. So it's a way of playing the actual original old school approach to things, and you tend to see. So, for example, when 4th edition came out, and all of a sudden a lot of people that had been playing 3rd edition suddenly realized that they were going to be playing something out of print. Suddenly, you sort of get released from that, and you're like, what? If I'm going to play something out of print, I can play anything. And we had a huge number of people say, okay, well, let me go back to the original and see what this looked like right at the get-go. And it's an absolutely valid, workable game system that has its own very distinct style, certainly distinct from 3rd edition, very distinct from 4th edition. I would say it's very distinct from 5th edition as well, although 5th edition did dial back some of what I tend to call the newer school, which is really the granularity. They dialed that back quite a bit. So 5th is actually somewhat closer to an old school style of play than 4th and 3rd.
Interesting. And it's interesting, I like that you pay such close attention to the specifics about the legalities of licensing, and I do too. And having gone down that exact same rabbit hole a number of times, I'm often really surprised at how much text from original D&D, like from a spell or strategic review, got copy-pasted into 1st edition, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, right into the SRD, and I can find specific sentences in the SRD of 2000 that came right off Gary's typewriter in 74 or 75 or something like that. Not everything. And it's interesting that because one of our colleagues on the ODD 74 forums, I think yesterday, said, you should ask Matt why he basically wrote a 3rd edition Pathfinder game. And I'm like, that's not the take I would come away from Swords and Wizardry with, frankly. It doesn't look very much to me like 3rd edition. Even though you're working off that SRD that several of us had, it really feels a lot more like original D&D to me.
Yeah, it's not a
I would mention to our viewers that if any of our viewers are looking for a way to dig into old school D&D or OD&D, Swords and Wizardry is a great option if you don't have the big bucks to shell out on eBay for one of those lovely white boxes. Somebody told me recently that they're going really high these days.
Yeah, we had it's and the other thing that Matt just said that's funny is when an edition goes out of print. I mean, like for me. When they went from 3.0 to 3.5, that was my personal jumping off spot, circa 2007. And I went out on eBay and I got this white box right here. And at the time, it was
you did exactly what it was that I was talking about. Yeah. The whole thing about if I'm playing something. Yeah,
100%. And I've been playing D&D for 40 plus years, and I never got this. I didn't have this. This was stopped being printed probably months before I got into D&D, actually. And so I got this in 2007, immediately fell in love with it. And so for me, some people say, oh, you're just being nostalgic. And I'm like, I didn't have this for the first 30 years of me playing D&D, and this is my favorite, this kind of play is my favorite play. And I'm so glad I got that. Anyway, my point is when I got that in 2007, I was like, $60? I have to make a real hard choice about that. I guess, yeah, it's close to my heart. I'm going to get this. And somebody yesterday said it's going for like $1,500 now.
It depends on the set and the printing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Wild.
Crazy.
Yep.
Crazy. So as Paul said, Swords and Wizardry, you can get you can get about 100 copies of that and give it to everybody that you know. It's really the better economic choice, frankly. All right, so one thing, so we're about halfway through here. So one thing that we have wanted to get into for a long time, and this came up from people online the last couple of days, said we want to talk about Matt's quick primer to old school gaming. And that's about a 20-page document that you printed in 2008. So right around the time when I was jumping from 3rd edition back to OD&D, and that would be 1 year before you published Swords and Wizardry. So I kind of want to dig into that. Many of our viewers have philosophy degrees, and so I feel like the quick primer is a good place to talk about the philosophy of old school gaming. So I've been looking forward to this. The last time that we spoke, Matt, you mentioned that it's in the back of your mind to possibly update that, because originally it was written in the context of 3rd edition, which was maybe peak crunchiness. Maybe 4th edition might be peak crunchiness, and that you might need to potentially update that for the sensibility of 5th edition players. What would be like the top 3 things you'd have to change in that sense?
Well, I think it's the overall tone of the thing, because when I was comparing, what I was trying to do was to explain that old school gaming is not pure nostalgia, since you already touched on that. There is a style of gaming that existed in the old school community. It's not necessarily defined by the old school community, but the thing was, it had disappeared largely from the mainstream publishing. And so what I was trying to do was to say, hey, here is an approach that's taken in the mainstream of gaming publishing, which is high level of granularity. And simply to point out, there is this other approach, which is where you get to with the more open-ended rules. And most of the things other than that are detail. When you're using open-ended rules, you will tend to get adventures that are structured somewhat differently, or you can get adventures that are structured somewhat differently. That's not necessarily a defining point of what old school gaming is. I really wasn't trying to get a definition of what old school gaming in total was. And so I was defining it by contrast. And that's the reason that I really haven't gone back in and tried to update it for 5th edition, because 5th edition is actually less of a contrast. Wizards deliberately went out and talked to people who were in the old school community and brought them in to get input from the OSR, which at that point was becoming quite a force on the internet, and so they were interested in hearing from it, not necessarily making an old school game, but taking input from that community about what was lacking. And in many ways, and they took that advice, and so 5th edition is certainly fits more with the mainstream or newer school or granular approach, but it's much less so than 3rd edition. 3rd edition tried to define every possibility in terms of ticking and tying it back to the character sheet, rather than to what a player might think of. And when you have something that is much more abstract in terms of the character sheet, and you are expecting the player to be playing a smart game, whether or not the character ought to be thinking that way, or however you do it, but player skill at something being something that was not necessarily either in character or based on the character sheet. So that was the distinction I was trying to make, and that distinction has, I think, become less stark with the later edition of the game, and that's really why I haven't jumped in there. If they had gone more granular, then I certainly would have been and more of the same back at you, in a later edition. But it's a lot harder to sort of the distinction being less clear. It kind of 5th edition muddies my definition of old school gaming because it is now more old school than what came before.
Interesting.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
I got to admit, when I crack open the 5th,
no one can describe. Yeah. Go ahead.
You're the guest, Matt. You get the floor when you need it.
I was just going to say, no one can really define, old school gaming because it means a bunch of different things. Are you talking about the community of old school gamers? Are you talking about what it is that's at the core of a play style? And even if you are, is that something about rules light? Is it about black and white art? There are a lot of different ways of doing it, but there's definitely a core of it that has nothing to do with nostalgia and simply has to do with a mindset and a rule style and a game style that had fallen out of favor in the mainstream. So,
I think
and nostalgia is also a part of a lot of the stuff that comes out, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with nostalgia.
Sure, yeah. But I think that you're absolutely right. Like, defining old school is so hard. I mean, I think that's the title of our first episode of this show ever was "What is Old School?" And we hemmed and hawed and tried to define it. And I don't know if we even got close. But
nailed it.
Yeah, did we?
Nailed it.
But the primer, I remember when I was running when I first got into old school around 2010, I started running my first BX campaign. I had printed out some copies of this thing. I think I just grabbed the first couple of pages, like the first section, so it's a nice trim, like 8-page booklet, and I had a bunch of those sitting on my table just for random people who joined the game. If they had no basis in old school, I was like, this pretty much hits the nail on the head. Like, if you want to know how is this game different from all the games you've played prior, just read this. So I think that, like,
because the difficulty was at that point in time that there are you would have somebody who had learned the basic concept of a role playing game through a granular system, and when you present something, any of the older versions, whether it's BX or Swords and Wizardry or whatever it is, those rules appear to be incomplete to somebody who is coming at it from a more granular system, and you have to sort of light bulb the fact that this is not something where something has been left out. This is something where you're supposed to look at it as a whole and be like, okay, this is how it's done, without having a specific rule for this. And so really the thing I was trying to get across was the idea these are not incomplete rule systems. You're reading it that way because of what you're used to, but it is not actually in any way incomplete. It's a different style of reading, a different style of playing. So,
that feeds into what I thought was a really great question from one of our colleagues named Dicebro on the ODD 74 forums, who asked, let's say Matt Finch is at a convention, could be Total Con, could be North Texas, and you get 6 players that show up at a table for an old school game, and they've never played anything but 5th edition. How do you prime them for that mindset in the 5 minutes or so that you have before they sit down?
Oh yeah, what I do in that situation is that I'm like, okay, so we've got some rules, and I'll be throwing you what it is that you do that's the resolution mechanic for stuff. But the way that this game is played, just imagine yourself inside the character. Tell me what it is that you would do. Don't look at your character sheet. The answer's not going to be there. You're probably used to seeing it on a character sheet. Just tell me what it is that you want to do, and then we'll talk. And in a lot of cases, I do give. I'm not a super big fan of the idea that you don't give any guidance to something. So if somebody says, I want to climb a wall, I will give them numbers. I'm like, you feel like, you're going to have maybe a 2 in 6 chance of climbing that wall, and you're going to roll a d6. Do you want to do that? Because I think that if you don't, part of a game is probabilities, and so I don't have a problem with giving people probabilities in terms of making good decisions. But that's the way that I govern it. Is just tell me, you're looking through those eyes. You're seeing orcs shambling forward toward you with spears. There's a door to your left. There's a door to your right. There's a stone wall up here that you think you might climb. What do you do? And that's people have a tendency to look down at their character sheet for a solution if the game system that they learned on was one where all of the character's capabilities were defined in terms of the character sheet. Even if the thing is what your chance to climb a wall, whether your chances, whatever it might be, you tend to do that, which is one of the things that I just as a social feature is that old school games, you tend to have a lot more eye contact with people because they can actually look at you. They're not
great. Great. That's it. I love that. I love that observation.
I love the advice of just immerse yourself and tell me what actions you want to take and let go of the rules, because that's frankly it's something I tell people all the time as well. And I think that translates not only just for people who are more used to the newer games, but folks who are coming to the table who've never played any game at all. And definitely the reaction I often get from those people is, oh, there's so many rules, I don't know what I'm doing, I'll make a mess of it. And I love being able to give that advice. I'm like, don't worry about the rules, please, it's better. Let go. Yeah. Just pretend that you're this person in this situation and tell me what you want to do, and we'll help you through it.
I find oftentimes I get really more exciting play from brand new, never played an RPG before, and the players are going to have interesting, unique perspectives, and it's really honestly creative in ways that me maybe being overly used to how the rules work would myself never think of. So I totally agree with that. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, let's dig into the primer. So the primer has four main tenets, and if I recall correctly, they are rulings, not rules. They are player skill, not so much player character skill. They are heroes but not superheroes. And the fourth one is don't worry about game balance. So on that first item, rulings not rules, if I go to the Frog God site webpage for Swords and Wizardry, the elevator pitch there, what the primary thing that it says actually is it says no spot checks. And I guess I'm going to say, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So bring on Matt Finch, our very good colleague. So there's a little bit of a rhetorical trick in the quick primer in that it says, okay, old school D&D had no search rolls for traps, which is true. And then it says there's no rolling dice to find a hidden lever. And then it says, and there's no rolling dice to find a secret door. Now, admittedly, Volume 3 does actually have rolls to find secret doors. So to find a secret door, and you have to say that you're searching, but there is, like you said, a 2 in 6 chance to find a secret door, or hear a noise, or to be surprised. And you did keep that in Swords and Wizardry. So was there, am I misinterpreting what you meant by that, or did you have a change of heart when you wrote Swords and Wizardry a year later and actually did have a die roll to find secret doors?
Well, specifically on the die roll to find secret doors, what I was really trying to get across in the primer is that there's not passive radar, and so the equivalent comment that would be made now would be there's no passive perception, and the point of that, there are a lot of very gamist elements in OD&D. They're speckled throughout. They're the sort of the hard points of the game system that's there. But the point that I was trying, because I wasn't necessarily trying to teach people how to play OD&D when I wrote the primer. I was trying to teach people, here is this general suite of old school play style, which is the light rules. And for that, the important thing to understand is that you have to interact with the adventure. You cannot simply rely on creating a character that will have a certain level of passive radar that will then be disclosed various important facts that you have to be saying, I want to look behind the curtain, things like that. So, I mean, I'm not sure if that's really the on-point answer to the question, but that is the objective of removing the idea that the character sheet is necessarily the be-all and end-all. Because, you've definitely got secret door checks. But you have to say, I am searching, unless you are an elf.
Okay, all right. Okay, Dan was our friend Ash in the chat, and I had the book here. That was my next question, so thank you for... Matt headed us off.
Yeah. But I think the point being that that OD&D, every game has rules. It has some hardwired rules, and there are the ones in OD&D. There are more hardwired rules in Advanced D&D. There are hardwired rules, in Second Edition D&D. They're not necessarily the same according to each of those different systems, so there are going to be rules in there, but the point being that it is that other than whatever it is that's gone on to your character sheet as a result of those rules being, whether it's a secret door check or whatever, that other than that, it is an interactive game where you are in the mental challenge of going through this dungeon that you're visualizing, and that you've got, that it's all talking back and forth for the most part. There may be puzzles to solve. That should be on the old school style for the most part. Those should be actual mental puzzles. They should not be something that would be solved by rolling, an intelligence check. Would be the way that you would do it in 5th edition, for example. 5th edition certainly suggests, and people will fudge it one way or the other and make it playable in whatever way works with their group. But there is an underlying ollie outs and free, basically, for where you can roll a die and get a clue or the entire solution. The suggestion in the rules is that it's the whole solution. I think most people, what they do is a clue. But to maintain that mental puzzle aspect of playing D&D, Gary would have no problem, I think, if what he wanted the challenge to be was that someone has put a crossword puzzle on the door of the temple and you have to fill in the crossword from tiles. He'd give him the crossword and be like, go to it. Whereas in 5th edition, there's the idea that you would have some sort of die roll to get around the mental puzzle, and I don't think that was the way that it was originally played. Partly because puzzles are fun. You get all kinds of stuff thrown into the way that people play older school D&D, where they're like, now here's a new challenge. Here's Jenga. Let's do play Jenga. Let's see how you do.
Right. Or this jousting game, or outdoor survival.
Sure. Outdoor survival being an excellent point. That might actually happen.
It's required. It's required in the rules. It actually becomes before dice or paper or players. You're supposed to have. You got look at that right there. It's like you get that, then you get dice, then you get players and a pencil.
He was a salesman. There's no question about
it. That's true. That's true. Paul has an interesting take on the puzzles thing. Is where I think Paul's take is he likes it as an add-on, like kind of an optional add-on to something. Is that right, Paul?
I've used it that way. I mean, puzzles can easily cut either way in the energy level of the table, right? Like if you have the right players, they might be super into it, and then great, here's the puzzle, go nuts. But my fear is always that there's one player at the table who's super into it, and they start mucking with the puzzle, and everyone else at the table then gets out their phones and disengages.
And waits.
Sure.
And
waits. You've got that problem with role playing too. I mean, you get somebody who's super into role playing,
it's true.
Or a group of people who are all into role playing, and one person is not. and you're leaving that person, having a rotten time. You've got to gauge everything. But the point being that I can see that if you take the worst rules lawyer, using 3rd, 4th, 5th edition, any of the granular system, you take your worst rules lawyer. You can see somebody making an argument like, you're not allowed to put a crossword puzzle in front of me, and my point is that this is something that can fit in the rules if it works with your group, and it tends to be sort of the idea of a completely tangential puzzle is a little bit pushed aside in the later versions, and that's not a bad thing if you've got a DM who's willing to pull it back in if it works. But when you're talking about what is the mindset that somebody who has just learned on one of the newer rule sets, you're going to have somebody who is possibly not realizing, hey, here would be a fun thing to do. Solve this Jenga puzzle, and you're able to get the gem out of the idol, and you get a bunch of people who like Jenga. They're like, great, let's play some Jenga, and then we're going to go find out what we do with our thing. It's just a more open, flexible kind of context.
The thing I always wonder about this, and I usually think of this more in terms of social interactions rather than puzzles, but like the role play element, right? Are we gonna talk our way past this guard by actually talking, or am I gonna roll some dice? Is that there's this weird separation between sort of like physical and mental ability and whether you test the player or their character, right? That like no one expects when I'm going to lift the portcullis that the DM is going to pull out a set of weights and say, go to it, show me that you can lift 100 pounds. Whereas when we get to something like a social interaction or possibly a mental interaction where it's like there's this puzzle and you need to figure it out, it seems reasonable that we get grumpy if we're like, oh, you're not immersing yourself, you just want to roll dice, that's no fun. And my question is always sort of like, where do you draw the line? Like, why do we even have mental abilities on our character sheets if we're not going to use them?
Interesting.
I think one answer to that is that if you look at the beginning of the timeline in OD&D, there are virtually no mental abilities tracked there. I mean, you've got things that have to do with how many spells you can get from Magic User, for how many additional languages you can get, but there really is no suggestion that the mental abilities have any interaction with the game itself as it is played by a player. I think with OD&D you've got the strongest form of the idea that player skill is way more important than your character. Even the ability scores, if you look at that, the ability scores do very little in advanced in OD&D for your character. It's you go up one level, you are tremendously you're getting more bonuses than you could have gotten from any rolling of ability scores. Ability scores become much more important relative to level later on. But I do, you certainly have to draw the line. But I think that where you really draw that line, your objective is to have a fun game. And and that's going to depend on you and your group. I think you have a particular group. You look around, that group could cause you to break toward one rule set or another in terms of which rule set is going. I mean, the rule set really shouldn't be first. What should be first is your group of players. But most people begin with the rule set as the beginning point. But I think you gauge it by your players, whether, is this a group of people who are going to have a lot of fun solving a problem with Jenga, or should we go a different route in terms of things? And hopefully you're not rolling every single thing based on skills where you're just rolling dice, but, there are probably groups where that would work best as well.
I think that's really insightful, right? Like it's really comes down to reading the room, and that's generally what I try to do as well. Is have options on hand for both directions, so that I can sort of get a gauge for is this group going to like this or not? Because I mean, I agree. Get your players together first, and then fit the game to them. Of course, when you're running a game at a convention, that is completely flipped upside down, right? Like you have no control over who's going to show up at your table. So yeah, I think any system where you give options, I think is really helpful, and that will bring me right back to lauding Swords and Wizardry, which of course gives you those options right there in the text, right? Like you can go A or B, you can have ascending or descending AC. What do you want?
Yeah. And is clear about what the default is, and then here's an option that I feel even that was a thing that didn't really get into books until like after 2000, and frankly, I was very appreciative when the books when game books started saying here's the default rule, and then be very clearly here's an option. For me, that worked very, very nicely to clearly define what the status was of those things, actually. So I really much appreciate that. Let me ask one other thing.
I think it's useful to say why. Here's one reason why you might pick one or the other. This is the overall, and we tried to do that. Especially in the initiative section, to say this is going to be the overall effect if you choose this one as opposed to this one or this one. So.
Yeah, totally. I very much appreciate that, and I think that's a good way to go. So the reader doesn't have to go back and redo that research that you've done. Why not put that helpfully in the book about what the pros and cons are there? Yeah. Let me ask one other thing. So with the fourth tenet in the quick primer of don't worry about game balance, I was just a little surprised to see in Swords and Wizardry a pretty robust challenge level system. So the monsters only have about 4 stats or so, and one of them is challenge level, and there's a table for creating new monsters and assigning challenge level bonuses for particular abilities, and you've got encounter charts set up that way and a list of challenge level appropriate monsters. How does having a challenge level system to create encounters face off against the don't worry about game balance principle?
There's actually no contradiction there. The don't worry. Here's the challenge level system is designed to allow the DM to create predictive strata of risk and reward. The players decide, and this is one of the things where even within the old school you get an argument because you got some old school DMs who are like, it is what it is, and they got to be able to run away. And my view on it is, the players have to know. The players should be able to decide what level of risk and reward you want to get. So if you think back, there was the question of, are we going to go into the first level, or do we want to go down to the second level? And we really don't want to go down into the third level because that's going to kill us until our fighter has plate mail. Until the first thing is get plate mail. Next thing is third level. And so that and that is the type of thing that I'm talking about in terms of balance. What you don't want to have happen is for the DM to say, you know what, until you've got some plate mail, you just can't find the stairs to the third level.
Okay.
That's what I'm talking about as being avoid focusing on game balance. But I do think it's very important that the players have the ability to gauge risk and reward and make decisions. And if they choose to go into an area that is super dangerous, hoping that they're going to find maybe some plate mail, by something, but they're willing to take that risk, then absolutely go for it. You don't want to be trying to block that. But in order to do that, the DM, because keep in mind, if someone's reading this for the first time, you've got no idea whether a purple worm is more dangerous than a goblin. So that you've got your challenge rating system to allow the DM to get a relative difficulty level there, to make it predictable that the stuff that's in the first level is going to be roughly the same here. Which means you need to have what's a challenge level. So all of that's built in there to allow the DM to construct an area that does have predictable risk areas, but not to enforce that on the players is the way that I view that.
Okay. If I get in a convention game being run by Matt Finch, are you going to be dialing the monster strength up and down on the fly to match the party, or is that something you don't do?
It is something that I do not do because although that's partly because of the type of convention game that I run. Almost always what I run is a Mega Dungeon crawl people can bring back, if people can bring character that they've played in the convention before, as long as it's not too high level. I've got a cutoff at 5th level. But that way you actually keep your experience points. You can level up from one game to the next. You can keep your magic items from one game to the next. And it is a basic, where do you want to go? And I'll give them the starting point, but they can head in any direction that they want to go to. So I'm very much running something that, I don't know, I guess you might call it simulationist or whatever it is, but it's, they go, it's there regardless of what it is that they've got with them. If I were running a scenario, I would definitely make whatever adjustments I wanted to do to make it risk appropriate for that group. But in general, when I'm at conventions, because I'm running, a beer and pretzels mega dungeon type of game, the risk level is not going to change.
Fascinating. That's great. I'm so glad I got an opportunity to ask that, actually, because that's been. I thought I had you stumped there, Matt. Honestly, I thought with the secret door roll, and I thought I was going to trap you with the elf issue, and I thought I had you cornered on the challenge level issue, but Matt Finch has far outthought me on this episode. I'll give you this one. This one I'll give to Matt Finch. I've been vested this time. All right, no shame in that.
That's about our time. So it's so we're gonna wrap up here. Thanks everyone for watching, and thank you, Matt, for joining us. If any folks have any more zingers that if we ever get Matt back on and want to try and trap Matt in the rules lawyering
on the trap Matt Finch game.
I need that help. I never got the 2 and 6 roll to get the trap going. So
there you go.
I need at least 6 options next time.
Yeah,
leave us some by Jenga if need be.
Excellent. If you want to see Dan and Matt play Jenga on this show, leave us a comment in the video comments below, or pose any questions for future interactions. We'd love to hear from you.
We very much would. And remember, if maybe you're new to the show, we're having Matt here on today, you can like, follow, and subscribe to Paul and me, the Wandering DMs, on YouTube and Twitter and Twitch and Facebook and GitHub. And you can see announcements about upcoming shows and guests that we'll have on the Wandering DMs channel. So we hope you'll do that.
If you prefer to listen to this show in audio-only podcast format, you can do that. The shows are available on our website at wanderingdms.com, also through various third-party carriers such as Google Podcast and iTunes and Spotify. If you are listening to us on one of those other carriers, please take a moment to rate and review our show there. That helps other users of that platform find us, and we really appreciate it.
We very much do. A couple comments on shows coming up on the Wandering DMs channel this week. Paul's back with more 10 Dead Rats coming up this Thursday. Getting close to the end of the season, actually. So I think you're closing up on a
season finale this Thursday.
Okay, catch that season finale, 8 to 10 p.m. right before Critical Role Thursday night. I will be back with my partner Isabel for more old school wargaming with Book of War, Army Mass Combat on Saturday night at 8 p.m. And I think we're planning a special show coming up next Sunday, actually. So we hope that you'll look for those things on YouTube and Twitch here on the Wandering DMs channel. Also, huge shout out to our patrons who support the Wandering DMs channel. We could not have great guests like Matt Finch on without your generous support. And also, support for getting the show ready. Got a number of questions to make this show better today, so we could not thank you enough. If you're in a place to join our generous patrons, we do hope that you'll go check out patreon.com/wanderingdms, find a tier level that's appropriate for you, and unlock a bunch of benefits that we have from Wandering DMs, like access to a private Discord server where we have ongoing chats about old school D&D and wargaming and all kinds of things like that, and 5th edition happening all the time, monthly behind-the-scenes videos, polls and surveys on things that you'd like to see on our upcoming shows or our blog articles, discounts on merch, and access to after-party chat that we have every Sunday afternoon. Right after the show, we go and we get on a video chat with our best viewers and continue the discussion for another hour or so afterwards. So we hope that you'll check out the Patreon for that. And now Paul will tell us all the things that I've forgotten about the Patreon.
You're good, Dan.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Today the thing I'm wrong about is that I didn't get anything wrong. Wonderful. Great. It's made a mistake. So, Matt Finch, we have been wanting to have you on for quite some time, and we are so happy we finally got you on. What a great, insightful, original D&D writer to have as a resource, and we are all so fabulously thankful that you're in the field and working on Swords and Wizardry and more adventures. So, thank you so much for being on today, Matt.
No, thank you. It was a great time, and it's a great show.
Awesome. We definitely will have you back on, and we'll dig into more Swords and Wizardry. Until then, look for Matt's Swords and Wizardry. If you haven't read it already, go and get the quick primer on old school gaming. We'll be waiting for Matt's upcoming adventure to be published on Frog God Games. We have links to all those things in the description on YouTube. And until then, we'll be looking forward for the next time Matt's on the show. And we will try even harder to trap him at that point. And maybe... So it's currently 1-0 Matt. So currently Matt Finch 1, Wandering M 0. I'm going to try to tie it up next time. So thank you for that, Matt. Don't forget that we, the Wandering Dams, we are live every Sunday afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So we do hope that you'll join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then. Bye, everyone.